In this part of the course, we are going to implement the functionality that will help us save the user credentials that the user sends from the client on our table in the database instance. But before that, since the password that gets sent from the client is a plain text format, it has to be hashed into something that's not going to be readable in case our database is compromised. So in order to do that, we have to use a package called bcrypt. And bcrypt has several methods, and we're going to use a couple of those methods here. And the first method that we are going to use is generate from password, and this method takes a slice of bytes that represent the password that gets sent from the client and an integer which represents the cost, and returns a slice of bytes and an error. You can actually go through the documentation and look at each function so you can get a better understanding of what each does. When using the function generate from password, there is an algorithm behind the scenes that does computation to generate the hash so it cannot be reversible into the plain text format. Now, going back to our editor, we invoke generate from password on bcrypt and pass into it a slice of bytes that represent the user password and the cost, which is 10. So looking at the definition of generate from password, we see it's expected to return to us a slice of bytes and an error. So we assign this function, this method invocation to the variables hash and error. And just for testing purposes, let's compare what's inside the hash that's generated and the plain text password, so we can see how different they appear. But before that, we need to check for error, and if there's an error, we need to exit from the function using log.fatal. Go back to your terminal, clear everything, and restart your server, and go to Postman and hit send. Now if you go back to your terminal, you can see the password is printed and the hash is also printed, so you can see the difference between the two. So the table in our database is expecting a string and not a slice of bytes for the password, so we have to change the hash that we generated, which is currently a slice of bytes, to a string using Go's native string function, and assign the returned value to user.password. Now let's go ahead and print the user.password, and this is after we have done the conversion from slice of bytes to string. And open your terminal and start the program, and on Postman click on send and go back to your terminal. So now you can see the generated hash, and this is after converting the slice of bytes we generated into a string. That is the format expected by the table inside our database. So now let's go back to our editor and get rid of all the print statements and invoke query row on the DB object that we created earlier. And into query row, we will pass a statement that will help us insert the user record into the table that we created. And the query row method accepts a query string and additional methods. So let's create a variable call statement and assign to it our query string, and the query string will be basically performing an insert operation. So we'll be inserting to users, and the fields will be email and password, and values will be these placeholders, $1 and $2, and this should be inside quotes because it's a query string. And we should also add returning the ID, so it should return the ID of the record. So into query row we pass a statement and additional arguments, the user.email and user.password, because we created those placeholders inside the query string for these parameters. And since we are expecting query row to return the ID, we invoke scan on query row and pass into scan the address to user.id. If you look at the definition of query row, you'll see query row is expected to return at most one row, and that row has a scan method. Therefore, we invoked scan on the row object, but scan is supposed to return an error or nil. So we check for error, and if there is an error, you can see here I'm calling respond with error and passed HTTP status internal server error, which is the code 500, into the function, and specify the error message as server error as well, and returned out of the function. However, if there is no error, then we need to assign to user.password an empty string, because we are going to return the user object to the client, and we don't want to send the password or to make the password exposed, even though it is hashed and it cannot be reversible. And then we invoke JSON.newEncoder and pass a response writer, and onto encode we pass the user object. However, instead of writing this all the time, we want to respond. We can create another utility function outside of the signup handler function, and this function will be called response JSON. So the function accepts a response writer and a data object, and we use a JSON encoder and pass data into encode. And we go back to the signup handler and set content type as a header and assign to the application/JSON. Then after having removed the JSON new encoder, we invoke response JSON and pass the response writer and our user value into it. Now save your code, go back to your terminal, restart the program, and open Postman and hit send to make sure you are making a post request to the signup endpoint. And you also have new credentials inside your request body. And after clicking on send, the response you get should have ID, email, and password attributes, and the status should be 200. And the password is empty because we decide to return an empty password. And if you go back to your Elephant SQL browser page and do select all from users and execute, you get a response with a new record appended to the end of the table, and you can see the difference between the hashed password and the plain text password. So in general, to recap what we've done, we created our signup handler, and we created a couple of variables, user and error, and we decoded the request body and mapped the values to user. And we also did some server-side validation for email and password. We made sure we were not getting an empty email and an empty password, otherwise we responded with error messages stating the requests are bad requests. And if everything was okay, then we generated a hash from the password, and we converted the slice of bytes that the generate from password function returned to us into a string, and we created our query string, and we made sure that the user record was created on the table using the db.queryrow method. And we also did some additional error checking, and finally we created a utility function to send a response to the client.